Alrighty, boys. You guys probably know about what's going on in Ukraine. It's super sad. It's kind of fucked up, and I kind of just want to talk about overall, like what I'm thinking. How like just kind of talk about it. In 2014, basically what Russia did was establish kind of this illegal referendum for Crimea to essentially leave Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. And this was, something that Russia had set up in an attempt to just kind of land grab Crimea and get away with it. Obviously, Ukraine had been dealing with a little bit of a civil war, coup d'etat type thing at the time in 2014, and they weren't really able to defend Crimea, so that's why Russian troops took this over so quickly. Obviously, this occurred like 7 years ago, which is such a long time ago looking back, but really not that long in terms of geopolitics. And really, it's kind of sad that people forgot about Crimea because I remember this happened. Obviously, the world they launched their sanctions on Russia, but people kind of forgot. They just kind of forgot about Crimea and said, "Oh, let that live in the past. Crimea is just one of those things that isn't worth fighting for." But I mean, that's still a big chunk of land. Crimea, I mean, that's like about the size of your Connecticut, your Rhode Islands. That would be like a Russian attack taking over the entire state of New Jersey, essentially. Now, why did Russia take Crimea over in 2014? Many people can point to this port right here, which is one of the biggest ports in the Black Sea. I would argue possibly the largest of all the ports in the Black Sea, other than maybe Istanbul. Istanbul is probably the biggest because obviously you have the strait and you have a proposed canal that will eventually turn Istanbul into an island of sorts, but that's besides the point. But you might be saying, why would Russia need a Black Sea port of this scale in the Black Sea, the heart of the Black Sea? Why would Russia want that? And it's mainly because Russia doesn't really have any ports. You might say, oh, RaiderKnight, Russia has a gigantic coastline. How do they not have many ports? But all of this is usually frozen over for most of the years. So, and there's nobody who lives out here as well. So all of this is kind of a pretty poor area to actually have naval bases, which is why Russia, they might want something like Crimea to assist them in that aspect. Obviously, Russia had some other decent sized ports over here next to Rostov on Don, but is this really one of their big areas to supply the Black Sea? It's kind of a weak port in a sense because obviously the Black Sea is so large, but a country like Russia, you'd expect them to have a lot larger presence in a sea like this. Now, obviously, Russia also has a pretty large port up here known as St. Petersburg, one of their biggest cities as well, and they have another northern port right here. I've never been able to pronounce the city's name, but that's one of their biggest ports is up here. But St. Petersburg can really only project so much naval power. I would say it probably gives them a pretty good amount of power in this region, but outside of that, I mean, they're kind of blocked off at Denmark. They can't really do anything. And again, even in the Black Sea, Russia is pretty blocked off by Istanbul. This is probably one of Russia's largest naval bases, is right here in Vladivostok, right by North Korea. This is where they can really poise the most of their power, but again, it's really not that much compared to like your Japan or your South Korea. Obviously, looking at the map, you can see how Russia is kind of limited in terms of their naval capabilities compared to somebody like the United States, who has basically the entire West Coast and the entire East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico all to really flex. Not to mention, we also have Hawaii. We have all these different little islands over here full of military bases. And to top it all off, we have Guam and we have allied bases basically all around the world. The USA is really a very lucky country, and people don't really realize that. Now, Russia claims that it's to defend these two regions of Ukraine, which had technically also succeeded from Ukraine in 2014, when Russia was doing their trolling, as I would call it. Some have even pointed at the fact that Russia, they took over Crimea in 2014, and how that did help them in terms of like the ability to possibly, cut Ukraine in half. No, I don't want to look too much into it because I feel like in 2014 it might have been easier for Russia to just completely invade and take over Ukraine, considering that the country was already going through a revolution. Maybe Putin kind of thought an invasion of Ukraine as a good afterthought. I don't really know why he decided to invade now rather than in 2014, where it would have most likely been a little bit easier for him, but that's kind of what I've been looking at. Now, obviously, people will say, RaiderKnight, just let Putin take over these two regions, free them from Ukraine, and then the war will be over with. And that would be fine. That would be fine if the fighting was only going on in these two regions. But as many of you know, the fighting isn't even really focused on these two regions, as Russia has barely even moved the front lines in these two provinces, rather instead marching troops across the border patrol stations in Crimea overnight as the war started, essentially taking over all these small villages in this province. Currently, there's a battle going on for Kherson, which is a very large city in southern Ukraine, and this is a very major city as well. And you guys might be saying, why is this a major city? There's actually been a lot of fighting going on for this one bridge, I've noticed. But Russia has had a hard time actually crossing this bridge, so we could see a little bit of a weakness now on Russia's attempts to actually cross in and take the city over. Obviously, pontoon boats and different ferry systems could probably get them across to take these areas over, and I would assume that this city probably doesn't have much longer left, considering it's already kind of on the brink of collapse. But why is this city so important to the war, and it hasn't even really been talked about? That's because it is at the end of the Dnieper River, which is the actual largest river in all of Ukraine, which essentially does cut the country in half. So you might be saying, what is the importance of this big waterway that is never talked about? This is probably what Russia is going to use to kind of cut Ukraine in half, in a sense. They'll probably use this as a defensive position, sending troops from the south to eventually meet up with their troops over here and take over the city of Mariupol, which is one of Ukraine's largest cities over here. Another big city that Russia is probably going to take in the coming days is Melitopol. I think that's how you say it. I don't know how to pronounce it, but these are some very major cities that Russia is looking to take over early to connect Crimea with their other troops over here in the mainland, which would give them a pretty powerful, capability right here in the south to actually push forward and assist troops over here, taking over these other large cities. Meanwhile, Russia had been allying with Belarus right under our noses for years, and nobody really talked about it. There were even rumors that Russia and Belarus would unite territory, with Russia annexing Belarus into his country peacefully, because Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, had always had a good alliance with Russia, and they're basically Belarus. I would say is basically a Russian puppet state. You're basically in Russia if you're in Belarus. Technically, Transnistria considers itself part of Russia and the Soviet Union, the final stronghold of the Soviet Empire, in a sense. That's kind of what they consider themselves over here, and I would assume if Russia eventually links up with this territory, it's probably just going to join Russia. That would make sense to me, at least, considering it never really had any international recognition, and it's always kind of considered itself part of Russia, anyways. Now, there's rumors that Russia has troops actually in this land and are planning to attack Western Ukraine. From what I've seen, I don't really know if that's true or not. They might just be talking about the Transnistrian army that already exists, and they just consider it as part of Russia's army to attack. But I would assume this territory probably won't get involved. If it does get involved, it will get involved later in the game, considering it's kind of surrounded at the moment. Probably wouldn't be very smart of them to attack. They might eventually get involved in this conflict, but at the moment, Transnistria is kind of sitting out on the sidelines. Some of you might want to know where Snake Island is, the island that is talked about where the Russian Navy surrounded it and basically killed everybody on the island because they refused to surrender. That's right here. It's pretty far away from the Ukrainian mainland. It doesn't really serve a whole lot of strategic purpose, but I feel like this whole story is really sad for this island, and I feel very sad for really all parties involved. I don't know why Russia decided to attack Ukraine. The whole thing is just a really sad event. But that's a lot of what's going on in the southern front and kind of your eastern front. Another big battle that's going on at the moment is for the Battle of Kharkiv, which is essentially being surrounded by Russian troops. The Russian troops went down this highway and they have been stopped for the moment around here in the northern part of Kharkiv. This is where a lot of the fighting is going down. What the Russians are trying to do, though, is they're trying to surround the city, sending troops on both sides to eventually meet up and kind of blockade the city off from its supply lines, which will eventually starve them out. When Russia does this, they'll send all their troops in a circle around the city and slowly march into the center, as we've seen in historical invasions before. So Kharkiv probably doesn't have long left. I am hoping that Ukraine will be able to defend this city, as it's one of their most important cities to actually hold on to. We really, if we want Ukraine to win, we really need to hope that they can hold on to this city. We need to hope that they can hold on to this city, and we need to hope that they can hold on to at least one of these cities. These are very important cities over here, and obviously, Kiev is one of the most important cities they have to defend. Now in Kiev, you might be wondering where the Russians have actually made it through. Currently, the Russians have actually had a pretty kind of odd attack for Kiev, in my opinion. What the Russians did essentially is they marched their troops along both sides of the river, taking over these really small villages in their way to Kiev. Currently, Russian troops have been in the Obolon district of the city, but recently they've actually gone further, airstriking this region of the city very badly. You guys might have seen in the news where they've been airstriking the zoo area. This is where the Ukrainian military have tried to hold on a defensive against the Russians that were pouring in from the north. This is where the Russians have slowly been moving into as they try to near the Capitol building. We might see it play out where the Ukrainians can actually defend this city, but at the moment I can't really give a clear yes or no answer. Now, is Ukraine's leader, president, actually located in this area? We don't really know. If I was him, I would consider evacuating, but obviously he is a strong person who has decided not to evacuate the city at this time. Now, would I recommend staying in the palace? Not exactly. And actually, I don't know if he is or not. He might have just been taking pictures over here for media, obviously. If I was him, I would stay in the city, but I would not stay that close to the fighting. Obviously, as a leader, he is very important to the Ukraine. If he dies, Ukraine is leaderless, and that will cause panic across the entire country, which is not really a good thing when you're trying to lead a defensive against an invading country. So Ukraine's leader staying alive is very important for the overall the country to stay together, I would say. But I do applaud his bravery by actually staying and fighting. Obviously, we saw earlier last year that Afghanistan, they didn't even really try, and they just kind of got swarmed, and Kabul fell in less than a fucking week. It felt like. Obviously, Ukraine, lots of Russian advances have already occurred, but overall, the fighting has been very brave and noble, and you gotta applaud what you see. Now, why, you might be asking, why does NATO not help Ukraine? Is Ukraine even part of NATO? And to that, it is not. Now, I'm going to kind of talk about what I'm actually afraid about because I don't think Ukraine is going to win this war. Ukraine, realistically, probably will get split down the middle from this little river right here. Russia will probably set up a defensive along this river as they regroup, remobilize, and then they'll probably make another push into the city of Odessa, into your cities like this, and they'll have some big battles probably right here in southern Ukraine as they push forward, possibly even making a march to Lviv at some point. Now, the real question on my mind is what is Russia going to do next? If they take over all of Ukraine, that gives them a lot of power right here. Obviously, they also own Transnistria for the most part, as well as Belarus. That gives them quite a bit of land to actually operate and really put pressure on NATO forces. Some of you might not even know that Russia actually owns a very small sliver of land right here, north of Poland, where Kaliningrad is located. Basically, what Russia could do is they could actually send their troops right across this little short gap of very small towns and villages and cut off the entire Baltic from other NATO allies. And then they could easily march their troops in, taking over all three of the Baltic states, which is a very scary scenario to think about. Now, obviously, if Russia did that, that would be attacking a NATO ally, which would bring in all the other NATO allies to attack Russia, which would be World War III. That is a scary thought to think about if nuclear war was exchanged. And we really have to hope that NATO is really preparing a strong defensive in this region at the moment in the scenario that Russia could possibly attack NATO allies after the Ukraine situation is all said and done. Now, you might be saying, why would Russia attack NATO and get blown up by nukes? And I don't think they will. I feel like that would be a very dumb choice for Russia to do that. They might, I don't know. I didn't even really think they were going to go with the Ukraine thing, but here we are. I feel like Russia would rather attack somebody like Georgia, who we really should actually consider adding to NATO at this point. So after the Ukraine war is over, if you see Russian troops mobilizing on the Georgian front, just say RaiderKnight told you so, and this would be a disaster as well. You might say, why would Russia attack this country? They already technically own this little region of the country, and they own another little region of the country that they took over in, I believe it was 2008. So an invasion of Georgia is actually pretty likely, considering hostilities between both countries is still pretty high. Obviously, this opens talks if China will possibly launch an invasion of Taiwan, which would be a disaster of major scale considering Taiwan is one of the largest economic countries actually in this area. Obviously, in recent years, we've seen China really crack down on Hong Kong, which was a former British colony which was given to China in the 90s under the hopes that China would not fully annex the territory until about 30-ish years down the line. And China has essentially just ignored that and kind of annexed it secretly without really any major repercussions. And that's not even really bringing into the fact that China's been building all these different man made islands down here for many years now in the South China Sea, which have very bad effects on trade, considering majority of the world's trade goes right through the sea region as it passes through China, India, the oil network as well. This is a very important region for trade, and China building military bases around here is not exactly good for world commerce. But yeah, this is RaiderKnight signing out. Cloud Gang is with Ukraine 1,000% over, and hopefully Ukraine can win the war. I really don't think they can. I'm really hoping they can though, because that would set a really bad precedent moving forward if Russia was to win this war. But this is RaiderKnight signing out, and peace.